Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our guest this evening is a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. He's a former four-star general of the United States with 6 consecutive commands, 5 in combat, including in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General David Petraeus. General David Petraeus, it is my privilege to welcome you to the India Today Conclave. Welcome to India Today Conclave, General.
Well, the pleasure is mine. Thanks, Gaurav. It's great to be with you. I wish I was with you personally and not just virtually, and I hope to be there in January for the Ricina Dialogue.
And I look forward to meeting you when you are here in January. General, this was the day, 7th and 8th of October, 20 years ago, when the United States bombed Afghanistan. Now, that was the time that you wanted to get rid of Taliban. 20 years later, what are your first thoughts with Taliban at the URG, with Taliban at the presidential palace in Kabul?
Well, first of all, I would have to say that I feel very privileged to have been part of it over the years, to have spent nearly 8 or 9 of my final 11 years in government engaged in efforts related to what we were doing against Islamist extremism that had brought the 9/11 attacks to our shores. As you noted, both in Afghanistan, Iraq, and even in the greater Middle East. But as I look at the situation, I have to say that seeing the Taliban in charge in Kabul is heartbreaking to so many of us who participated, not to mention to the many Afghan people who are now suffering once again under a government that has a very extremist interpretation of Islam. It is tragic, again, for those people. It's very, very disappointing. Frankly, it's disastrous. And I am very worried for the Afghan people who face what appears to me is going to be a humanitarian catastrophe. The economy has collapsed. The electricity is not going to keep on flowing if the Taliban don't pay the Central Asian states for it, or Iran for the refined fuel products. So there's a very, very long, very cold, very hard winter, and it could be a very hungry winter that lies ahead for Afghanistan and its people.
It indeed would be, and especially the question would arise that how do you channelize aid into Afghanistan? Does that mean legitimizing the Taliban? And would that also mean, Pakistan in a way will once again be in full control of the situation in Afghanistan? Is that an apprehension? Is that a fear? Or is that fait accompli?
Well, the biggest challenge with Afghanistan was always, of course, the unwillingness and perhaps even the inability of our partner Pakistan to actually take control of its own territory and to eliminate from its territory the headquarters of the very organizations that were making life so difficult for the Afghan people, for our forces, and for Afghanistan itself. I think it's a very mixed blessing to Pakistan to have the Taliban in charge. Number one, there is a lot of discord. There's very substantial disagreement between the two major elements, the Taliban and their ostensible partner, the Haqqani network. As you will know, Mullah Baradar is not even in Kabul right now. He retreated to Kandahar. The Haqqani largely control Kabul and much of the eastern part of the country. You still see fighting. There is a resistance that is ongoing. I don't think that's going to go away. If anything, I think the terrible conditions in Afghanistan will lead people to join the resistance. And of course, you also have the Islamic State Khorasan group, which has been carrying out attacks. And I just saw a news report that there may have been an explosion in a mosque in the northern part of the country just in the last 24 hours. So I think, again, this is Pakistan is going to once again have millions of Afghan refugees on its soil. It's a country that is very fragile in many respects, and it can least afford to have millions of Afghans once again on its soil, as it did, of course, some 20 years or so ago. when it has a similar circumstance. So I think this is going to be very difficult, actually, for Pakistan. And whatever cheers may have gone up in Islamabad about the fact that the Taliban got rid of the Afghan government, I think will be short-lived.
The question is, you were the commander on ground, you were the commander of the Central Command, you were the director of Central Intelligence Agency. Why did America not hit terror at source?
Well, there was some of that, certainly. Obviously, we did the operation. In fact, in my final few months as the commander in Afghanistan, that brought Osama bin Laden to justice. There were numerous actions against al-Qaeda leaders over the years. You may recall that the most dangerous job in the world, probably still was to be the number 2 in al-Qaeda. But at the end of the day, we could not go after the Taliban headquarters that was in Baluchistan province. I used to tell the chief of army staff in Pindi, there's a reason that the headquarters of the Taliban is called the Quetta Shura. It's because they're located outside Quetta, which the last I checked is on your soil, the capital of one of your provinces, and you seem to be able to do nothing about it. But of course, we were always in a very difficult position with Pakistan. They controlled the 2 ground lines of communication in and out of the country. They did allow certain activities to go on that I can't get into in detail, particularly when I was in my last government position. And it was, there was this term that was used at times of frenemy, that Pakistan was both a friend and to some degree, an adversary, an enemy even. That was making it very, very difficult. And the single biggest challenge, of course, about Afghanistan was that the enemy headquarters that mattered most were beyond our reach. And in a situation like that, you ultimately have to accept that you cannot win. You cannot actually defeat the adversary, the enemies. All you can do is manage it. And of course, it was the frustration in the United States at the very, very top that led to the lack of strategic patience that was needed really to continue the effort to sustain a sustainable commitment, which many of us thought we had actually achieved with only 3,500 US troops, not a single battlefield loss in the final 18 months until the tragic attack by the Islamic State at the entry control point to Kabul International Airport. But of course, again, decision makers get paid to make decisions. Policymakers do establish policy. The decision was made. The military and the other elements in the US government all saluted smartly and implemented that policy. And we are where we are now, which is, again, I think, a very desperate situation for Afghanistan.
So was this a wrong policy? Was it a wrong decision or wrong implementation of that decision? The manner in which the Americans left Afghanistan and left not just the Afghanistan National Defense Forces, but the people of Afghanistan, they were literally hung out to dry.
I don't think anyone actually argues that the way the departure, the way the evacuation was carried out was smooth or orderly or something to be proud of. I think it was obviously quite chaotic. And the fact is that there was an inability to assess how significant not just the withdrawal of US forces, but US air power, and then the US contractors who maintained the Afghan Air Force. Keep in mind that the Afghan force, after you take out the police and border police, it's only about 150,000 actual soldiers. And then about 40,000 of those are reserves in special operations, commandos, and all the rest. And the way you configure that force is the only way you can in a country that is very large, is very mountainous, and has limited ground lines of communication. They do have to protect different population centers, key infrastructure, roads, networks. And when they are hit by the Taliban, the key is that you respond with tactical troops. You respond with helicopters, with close air support, with aero medevac emergency resupply. And the problem, of course, was that once we withdrew our contractors, they couldn't keep all of those sophisticated US-provided helicopters, planes, and so forth operating. I actually did, months in advance, say publicly that I feared a psychological collapse of the Afghan forces if they were simultaneously hit around the country and they realized that no one was coming to the rescue. I think it's actually natural They did fight initially. If you look at the tough fighting around Kandahar, the tough fighting in Herat, some of the other areas in the north. But once all of the contractors were gone, and once the Air Force could not be maintained and it was getting shot up, they were really quite heroic in the early days of this. Then you should expect what we saw, which is that they're going to cut a deal. I mean, Afghans have survived for centuries by realizing who is going to win and then cutting a deal with that individual. There's a degree of chameleon-like behavior that I think all people can adopt in very desperate circumstances. And I think the inability to appreciate that led us to withdraw our military first, while our diplomats and civilians and U.S. citizens and green card holders, special immigrant visa holders, to whom we have a moral obligation. Look, the special immigrant visa individuals in particular spent 2 or more years on the battlefield with our forces sharing risk and hardship. We owe something to them, and there are still tens of thousands of them that we need to get out. And a lot of us and the U.S. government is determined to make good on that obligation. And a lot of people are working very hard to do that. But clearly the evacuation was not good.
Will that be possible now, given that the Islamic State Khorasan is going after the Taliban, the Haqqani network? In your appreciation, is Pakistan then in control of not just Kabul, but major parts of Afghanistan? And what do you make of the Panjshir resistance? Instead of leaving these billions of dollars of worth of equipment for Taliban, should they not have been given to the Panjshir resistance instead? Was that even possible?
Not really. Again, remember that the final bit of equipment that we had basically that was abandoned was all completely demilitarized. It's never going to drive or fly or operate again. That was at the airfield. The material that collapsed with the Afghan forces, obviously there wasn't much that we were going to be able to do with that. There was quite a bit that did make its way up into the Panjshir. But you asked, are the Pakistanis in control? No, I don't think so. They have never really controlled. They have a relationship. They can communicate with the Haqqani, as they always did when the Haqqani headquarters was located within a couple of kilometers of the Pakistani army headquarters in North Waziristan. So again, there is communication, but there is not control. And I don't think Siraj Haqqani is going to take orders from Islamabad unless he wants to accept those orders. And the same will be true actually with respect to the Taliban leadership itself in Mullah Baradar, who, as I mentioned, is not even in Kabul right now because of the difference of opinion. So this is going to continue to be a chaotic scene. And again, Afghanistan is broke. It has no money. The reserves around the world are frozen. The IMF and World Bank have put them on hold. As you noted, individuals want to provide humanitarian assistance, but not through the Taliban. They do not want to strengthen the Taliban, this, again, ultra conservative, extreme version of Islam. So again, tragically, as is so often the case in these situations, it's the people who are going to pay the price for what has happened.
Because reports seem to indicate that Taliban is already using food as a weapon. They are starving out minorities. They are starving out people who are resisting them. So what do you foresee in the weeks, months ahead? A civil war in Afghanistan, different factions fighting with each other, or is it time for the United Nations to intervene? Because who else can deliver all that aid that Afghanistan requires to all sections and not just to a section that the Taliban may want?
Well, I'm sure that, again, the United Nations and others will come forward. A number of international aid organizations are seeking to provide more assistance. There's a keen recognition of what I have described, that this is going to be very, very grim during this winter, that the result will be, as I said, millions of refugees, very cold, dark, hungry winter lies ahead. But it's going to be very difficult. You're not going to see any country go in with force of arms and say, okay, we're taking over. We're going to, shove aside Taliban. You guys can't do this. We'll take care of it for you. And clearly, there has already been persecution of minorities. There have already been Hazara. There have already been others that have been pursued by the Taliban. And the Taliban are also still in many places going house to house trying to find those individuals that worked with us, that worked with the Afghan government, that were senior individuals in the past. And again, we owe it to a number of these individuals to do everything we can to get them out. And I do think there will be some leverage because of how desperate the situation is going to be. I do think that the Taliban, the Haqqani, they are going to realize that they are going to be in big trouble if they can't provide better for the people. And right now, there's no prospect of them being able to do that because we provided 75% of the government budget in the past. No one's going to step in and do that.
And I mean, Pakistan clearly on the verge of bankruptcy itself. Pakistan cannot do that, though it may try to use Chinese money. But in your appreciation, will China want to fill this vacuum?
No, it's just not China's model. They typically do Belt and Road Initiative projects, as you know, where they loan you money, and which is paid back to you, and use their own people and their own materials and so forth. And again, that is a developmental model that they employ. In some places, it has worked reasonably well. There's some others where I think there have been some lessons learned, but it is just not their model. And again, China is cautious. The reports of China rushing in to be in Bagram Air Base or something like that, I think will generally prove to be inaccurate. Remember, they put billions of dollars into a copper mine in northern Logar province, just south of Kabul, and again, gave it all up when they were on the receiving end of, by the way, the Taliban and Haqqani rockets and mortars. So again, you're not going to see them. They're more concerned, I would contend, Gaurav, actually about Islamist extremism coming out of Afghanistan rather than them going in, even as attractive as the many minerals are. I mean, the mineral worth of Afghanistan is extraordinary. It is in the trillions with an S on the end of dollars. But if you can't get it out, if you don't have the lines of communication, if you don't have the human and physical capital to do that, it's very, very difficult to exploit it. So maybe over time, I would love to see some projects, actually. I'd love to see the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline come to reality. We dreamed that up when I was the commander over a decade ago. But obviously it has not been possible because of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan and also, of course, some other issues with your Western neighbor.
You're absolutely right, because TAPI is something, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline is something that a lot of investment was to be made. But the point is, with an extremely unstable Afghanistan and a completely unreliable Pakistan, and your appreciation, is Pakistan, has it emerged, in your view, victorious after this? Or will Pakistan's troubles only increase, especially at the Durand line, with Taliban now saying they don't accept the Durand line?
Well, again, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, any celebration that may have been seen in Islamabad should be very short-lived because of what is now going to happen. And what is going to happen in Afghanistan is going to result in massive flows of refugees into Pakistan. And Pakistan, as you noted, is already quite fragile economically, financially, even to some degree, politically and socially. And this will not help. So whatever satisfaction they may have seen in the U.S. leaving and the coalition departing and the Afghan government flying away and so forth, I think they probably will look back and ask whether it wasn't actually better before than it is now. They're also, of course, going to lose all of the assistance that we used to provide because of their role in helping us maintain our forces in Afghanistan, and an enormous amount of economic benefit that they got literally just from everything going into and out of Afghanistan, not just military goods and services, but basic foodstuffs and all the rest of that. I mean, the Afghan economy, in many respects, was built around an international presence that had money that could spend in the major cities in particular. And a lot of that came into the country, the very majority of it, of course, through Pakistan.
General Petraeus, there was a video that was going viral, at least in this part of the world, and I'm sure you've seen this in America. A former Director General of Pakistan's ISI was boasting that Pakistan took US money to defeat then USSR, and then Pakistan took US money to defeat the United States in Afghanistan. Given Pakistan's stance there are Republican senators, and I think 22 of them, who want sanctions on Pakistan. As former director of CIA, someone who knows Pakistan like the back of his hand, will sanctions work on Pakistan, and is it time to put sanctions on Pakistan?
Look, I'll leave that to the politicians. I don't do domestic politics in the United States, and generally that has served me well. As I indicated before, there was always a frustration with our Pakistani partners. Admiral Mullen and I, in particular, had a very close relationship with General Kiani, who I think was the longest serving Chief of Army Staff. There actually was a period where, when Ambassador Holbrooke and I were working together when I was at U.S. Central Command and he was the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, we actually thought that Pakistan was working with us. And there were periods where we had a degree of cooperation, especially again during that particular period. And in 2009, you may recall that the Tehrik-i Taliban Pakistani were literally threatening Islamabad from Swat Valley. And we watched with admiration and helped. We had special forces actually bringing in certain assets that we could help them with in terms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, not strike. But we were helping their forward units as they went into Swat Valley. I mean, very, very heroic and impressive operations. And then they did Bajur and Momand and Khyber and Orakzai and South Waziristan. And we're all ready to cheer as they're going to clear North Waziristan. And all of a sudden, winter came, they ran out of momentum. And that's when we started to realize, well, actually, they're fine going after the TTP, but they're not going to go after the Haqqani at the end of the day, or the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, or certainly the Taliban down in Quetta. So all of this, again, we had our ons and offs, and it took us some time, including when I was the CIA director, and I dealt with Director General Pasha, and would meet all around the world. But, you know, we knew that we were being strung along, as the saying goes, to a considerable degree. It was very frustrating. But at the end of the day, they had a position that did allow them to do that because of our dependence on those lines of communication. And indeed, when they cut those lines of communication for nearly 45 days in the fall of 2011, when I was the CIA director, it was very, very difficult. So this is the context. Again, you know, occasionally I used to say, hey, look, this is reality. Get over it. Get used to it. This is what we're dealing with, and stop wringing our hands and try to figure out what it is we can do, but realistically and coldly look at the situation and acknowledge it as it is. And we did. And there it is.
General, if I may now shift to what the United States says is its next key focus area, the Indo-Pacific. Now, did the United States pull out of Afghanistan to be able to focus on Indo-Pacific? And if yes, in the coming decades, you see rising confrontation with China?
Well, I hope not, actually. And in fact, I'm hoping that the way the administration is going about this will actually prevent that from happening. So let me describe this to you. Think of the guy in the circus who has there's a plate and a stick. Actually, he's got a bunch of plates and a bunch of sticks. And he gets a plate up on a stick and he gets it spinning and it's spinning. Then he goes over, he does another one, then he comes back, spins this one again, then he gets another one. And pretty soon you've got a whole bunch of plates spinning. The U.S. is the guy in the circus who has to keep the most plates spinning of all. And the way the administration, I clearly come at Afghanistan from a different perspective. I would have adopted a different approach, but that's done. It is over. It didn't really free up that many troops, or anything like that, or that much money. It was only 3,500 troops, and 10 or 20 billion a year. But at the end of the day, the big focus of this administration is exactly right, and it is to achieve a coherent, comprehensive whole of governments with an S on the end, including all of our allies and partners around the world, with emphasis on the Quad, of course, which India is a member of, policy for China. So it's a comprehensive approach to China in order to ensure that there are not misperceptions, there's not miscommunication, there are not mistakes, unneedless confrontation, and hopefully inability to cooperate on some issues where there should be common interests, like combating the pandemic, the climate change, the global economic recovery, et cetera, competition in certain areas, but avoiding actual confrontation. And I think that is exactly right. And to its credit, I think the Biden administration was doing very well in that regard. Remember, they engaged in the Indo-Pacific, all of the leaders there. A lot of that was virtual. Later, more recently, they did the physical Quad meeting. They then went to the UK, did a summit, and then the G7 at the UK. Then they did an EU summit. Then they did a NATO summit. Then there was even a summit with Putin. And then there was the first virtual encounter with President Xi. Noting that now there's going to be a true summit between the two leaders at the end of this year, although it appears that it will probably be virtual as well. But the entire main effort, the biggest plate on the stick, bigger than all the other plates, is the plate that represents the U.S. and its allies and partners' relationship with China. There's a lot of other plates that have to keep spinning. And Afghanistan is still there because there is a possibility of Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, others that could project international extremism. There's a number of other locations around the world where there are Islamist extremists. There's North Korea, there's Iran. Iran is going to come to a boil here, I fear, sooner rather than later. There's Russia, there's domestic populism. I mean, there's all kinds of issues. But at the end of the day, the issue that you highlighted, the relationship with China, the Indo-Pacific, and really the U.S. and the world, that is the one, that plate is bigger than all the others, and that's the one that you can never allow to stop spinning.
But how reliable would the United States be in the long run? Some would argue that you pulled out of Afghanistan, when the Americans pulled out of Afghanistan, friends in Afghanistan were let down. When AUKUS happened, France felt let down. Would there be a time that the United States' priorities would change, and those who may put their eggs in the American basket may again be hung out to dry?
No, I don't think so, actually, and in part because of what has happened. I mean, Washington, the people here in Washington, this administration, these are seriously bright, seriously experienced, seriously focused people. Again, you can debate whether we should or should not have left Afghanistan, and I have, but again, that's done. They know that they gave China a stick with which to beat us, and China did. China immediately said, see, we told you, America's a power in decline. We are not, by the way. I'm in the investment world with partner in one of the biggest investment firms in the world, and I'm telling you, the U.S. economy is coming roaring back, as are many others. But no, we handed China an issue with which to criticize us. And they also said that they're an undependable partner, and they look across the Taiwan Strait to some degree when they do that. So, but that's understandable. And then the AUKUS thing is a little bit more nuanced. I've talked to very, very senior people in the administration in the last 2 weeks, and there was clearly a misperception. But the belief was that Australia had actually engaged with France, and this wasn't going to be a huge surprise and so forth. Obviously, that didn't turn out to be. And in fact, I think the whole Afghanistan focus, which was required because of this chaotic withdrawal and everything else, that took people's attention away from other stuff. But their attention's back on that. Look at where the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor have been this week, by the way, also where I was in Europe. They were doing all of the regular meetings, a lot of meetings in particular, of course, with France to get this situation back in the box. And I think just the fact that they did what they did, they realize that we must be seen as a dependable partner, and they will indeed set out to do that. And as the economy comes back, that will establish a very firm foundation on which to build all this policy.
General, the last 30 seconds, if I may, what do you make of Chinese planes repeatedly violating Taiwan's airspace? Is that posturing, or is there something far more serious that the Chinese could be up to?
Well, first of all, they're not violating their airspace. They're actually entering their air defense identification zone, which is a sort of somewhat of an arbitrarily drawn. They're nowhere near their airspace. They're coming to the southwest of it. Yes, they're sending a message, and certainly others are sending messages back. It is a message of displeasure about some statements that have taken place and some actions and all the rest of that. But at the end of the day, I think both sides, everyone is being quite careful. This is part of signaling back and forth. And indeed, this is highlights the importance of the summit that will take place later this year between President Xi and President Biden.
I will let that be the last word on this part of the show. Many, many more questions, but when you come to India in January, look forward to meeting you, General Petraeus. As always, many thanks for joining us here on India Today.
Thank you, Garth. Good to be with you.